Hello again, everyone. This is the video for reading the first chapter of Jip, his story. Remember, this is written by Katherine Patterson, who is a Vermonter. She lives in Barre, Vermont, so right near your dad's, probably somewhere around your dad's at Aubrey. I'm going to go over a few things that we talked about before we read it in class, because we only read the first chapter in class, and I just want to review because it's been a few weeks. So remember that this is set in the 1850s on a farm in Vermont. And you remember that in those times, people who could not take care of themselves, who did not have jobs or money to support themselves, the rest of the town did not want them wandering around the town or sleeping outside or just being in their area. So all of those people were sent to what was called a poor farm in the town. There used to be a poor farm in Rockingham. This book is not set in Rockingham. One of the reasons I can tell that is because there is a granite quarry, and there are granite quarries in a lot of places in Vermont, but in Barre, there are granite quarries. In fact, there's a little town near Barre called Graniteville, a little village maybe. So anyway, this book is set in Vermont on a poor farm near a granite quarry. And you remember the main character is this boy named Jip, and he doesn't know his background. He was found as a toddler wandering along a hill, and nobody knows where he came from. And so the story has sort of come that there were gypsies passing through, and he fell off their wagon, and so that is why he was given the name Jip, for short for gypsy, even though it is not spelled anywhere near the same as gypsy. Okay, one more thing I want to talk about before we start reading is, you remember that when we talked before, and we've always said this, but when you read something and you see something that you know we wouldn't say now, you read it, but you don't repeat it, okay? So remember, in this book, there is a mentally ill man, and his name is Put, or short for Putnam. And in the book, they call him, they use words to name him that we would not use now. They use lunatic and they use idiot. Okay, and again, those are not words we would use now, but in the time of, in the 1850s, though, that was the language of that time. So in order for Katherine Patterson to make this book feel authentic, she used words that we would not use now to describe people who have mental health problems. Okay, all right, so let's open up to, let's see, right past the table of contents, to this page that has just this little bit written. All right, we'll read this first. My life began the afternoon of June 7th, 1847, when I tumbled off the back of a wagon on the West Hill Road, and no one came to look for me. I say it began that day, but maybe I'm wrong to say that. Maybe I should say the life I know now began nearly 8 years later, when Overseer Flint brought the lunatic to the town poor farm. Okay, so remember that in the town, there would have been a person who was elected, who was the overseer of the town poor farm. So he was the one who controlled what money went to the town poor farm, and he would check in, but he did not live there. There would be a manager at the town poor farm who lived there, often with their wife or family. So in this book, the manager of the town poor farm is named Mr. Lyman, but the overseer is Mr. Flint. So there's just different levels of authority. So obviously Overseer Flint has a higher level of authority than Mr. Lyman, but Jip has to answer to both of them. Okay, so chapter 1, The Gypsy Boy. Old Berthy was the one that told Jip. A lunatic boy, she said, leaning so close Jip could count the hairs in her nostrils. A raving lunatic, she sniffed. We're all of us poor, and there be some, she rolled her eyes toward old George and Sheldon Morse, who is simple. But we're harmless, ain't we, boy? What do they mean bringing a lunatic amongst poor God-fearing folk who done no harm nor had no luck in this cruel world? Jip nodded solemnly. He never argued with Berthy. Once he dared question her when she said Ethan Allen had been a fool. After all, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys were the only genuine Vermont heroes Jip had ever heard tell of. Ethan Allen was a hero, he'd said. She'd slapped him across the face so hard it stung. He wouldn't have credited that old wrinkled hand with such strength. I said, fool boy, don't go contradicting your elders. He didn't again. Besides, why were they bringing a lunatic to the poor farm? Money, Berthy said. It'd cost the town too dear to send him to the asylum. Too dear means too much money. The overseer of the poor had appeared several days earlier. Mr. Flint was an imposing man, tall enough to look down his nose at most of the population, with deep buckshot eyes and sunken cheeks like a skeleton. You could tell from his frock coat and stovepipe hat what an important man he was in these parts. Indeed, he was the wealthiest and most important man that any of the residents knew of. It was he that had put each of them here on the town poor farm and demanded their gratitude on every possible occasion. So he wanted them to always be thanking him for having put them on the town poor farm. Overseer Flint drove his gig down the rutted road that morning in early April, cursing and whipping his mare, urging her through the spring mud. So can you picture that? Overseer Mare whipping his horse as he's riding along in his wagon to get to the town poor farm. The residents, and that means the people who lived at the town poor farm, the residents gathered respectfully in the yard to welcome his arrival, could hear the unchristian language from where they stood, huddled against one another for warmth. They reckoned the overseer above the law, even the biblical injunctions about the Lord's name that tempered the speech of more ordinary mortals. So they thought that it was okay for him to swear because he was so important. Despite the overseer's powerful tongue, the gig's left back wheel stuck, held fast in the greedy clay. So it was a very muddy road, and when clay is part of the soil, that can make it even more sticky and hold things into the mud. Jip, Sheldon, go help Mr. Flint, Otis Lyman, the farm's manager, yelled. Jip sprang forward, grabbing Sheldon's big rough hand. Sheldon looked at him, puzzled. We got to get the overseer's wheel loose, Sheldon. You and me together, eh? All right, Jip. Sheldon was always obliging. He just didn't catch on too fast. The overseer stopped his red-faced cursing when the two of them got close. Good day to you, Mr. Flint, sir. I expect you better get down, sir, Jip said. The overseer peered skeptically at them, the skinny boy and the husky young simpleton. So a simpleton is someone whose brain doesn't think very well. Okay. The mare, straining at the reins, was sweating, her eyes wild from pulling. Couldn't the man see his own weight was making the wheel sink deeper and deeper? If'n you'd like down, the boy began. The man didn't wait for him to finish. His mouth pursed, he climbed down gingerly to the less muddy side, then threw his reins back toward Jip. Jip gathered them in one hand and watched as the tall man tiptoed around the muddiest ruts, picking a cautious way up the road to the crowd watching from the farmhouse yard. Wait, Sheldon, Jip said quietly, when the man seemed out of earshot. We got to make friends with this poor critter first. Mr. Flint has aggravated her something fearful with all his whipping and cursing. He moved to the mare's head. Remember, a mare is a female horse. He moved to the mare's head and began to speak soothingly to the beast. The horse tossed her head once, but when the boy reached a chapped hand to her neck, she let him stroke it, barely stamping her muddy foot. Now, Sheldon, Jip said, his voice hardly louder than a spring breeze on a maple branch, just put your shoulder on that wheel, and when I say gee, you shove, all right? Sheldon grinned, nodding his prematurely balding head. I'm strong, he said proudly. That's right, Sheldon. You ain't got extra sense, but you're a lot stronger than most anyone. I can't do without you. All I can do is talk sweet to this here horse. You're the one what's got to save the gig for the overseer. He'll say, thank you, Sheldon, you're a good boy. He might, Sheldon. He just might. Anyhow, we got to do it, thanks or no. Lacking the overseer's weight and anger, and with Sheldon's strong shoulder against the wheel, the little mare eased the gig from its muddy trap with little effort. Jip patted her neck, kissed it, and praised her. You too, Sheldon. You done every bit as good as the horse. Only she was upset, so I have to pet her special. I know, Jip. They got no thanks from Mr. Flint. By the time horse, boy, and man had walked into the yard and Jip had tied the reins to the hitching post, Mr. Flint had forgotten all about them. He was deep in a heated discussion with the farm manager, whose bulbous nose gleamed out redder than ever as he tried to argue with his superior. So a bulbous nose is kind of a wide nose. Mrs. Lyman was shooing all the residents into the house and out of hearing. You too, Jip, Sheldon. Everyone inside. None of your affair. The overseer has business with Mr. Lyman, not with you. She was clucking like a mother hen, waving her arms at them. We mustn't get in the gentleman's way. Come on now. They obeyed, if grudgingly. What could they do? They were like chicks here on this farm, pecking about to keep alive. There were 7 of them at the time, 4 because they were old with no one to care for them. Berthy, Joe, Willis, and silent Throsina. 2 were simple, Sheldon in his early 30s, and George, who was sickly and old and probably simple as well. Like Throsina, he seldom spoke, so no one could be quite sure. And then there was Jip. So these are the author is telling us about who lives on the farm. And then there was Jip. When he arrived, Mr. Lyman had examined his teeth and pronounced that he was 2, or maybe 3, but no one knew for sure. He had fallen off the back of a wagon on the West Hill Road. Eyewitnesses, at least some who claimed to have been there on the usually deserted road, said the wagon was hell-bent for Hades, careening around the sharp curve about a mile out of the village when this odd bit of a boy just tumbled right off the back. So hell-bent for Hades, that is a saying that means going really, really fast, dangerously fast. No one bothered themselves to come back and claim you, Mrs. Lyman had said quite matter-of-factly. But didn't I tell you who I was? Jip had figured early on that the maybe 3-year-old child who fell off the wagon was old enough to tell somebody who he was. You were speaking nothing but gibberish at the time when you wasn't screaming your head off, she said. Maybe you was a gypsy babe, as some say, or maybe you knocked your head on a stone when you hit the road. She cocked her head and studied him for a minute. You ain't overly clever, not simple like Sheldon, but you likely lost something in that fall. She tapped her own head meaningfully. Still, Jip was smart enough to wonder. There was plenty of time to ponder on things at the farm. He worked hard as he and Sheldon were the only able-bodied residents, but most of the work left his mind free to ponder. So to ponder means to think about. He was able to think as he was working. Why, he asked the chickens as he threw them grain, why had no one come back for him? Wouldn't you notice, say, if you began the day with 6 children, and come night the count was down to 5? Even if you were in a powerful hurry to leave these rocky hills to get west to where the good land lay, wouldn't it cross your mind to wonder what had become of your missing young'un that you once had but suddenly wasn't there any more? Even a goose can count her goslings and know if a fox got one in the night. So think about that. As a mother, do you think a mother would forget or not even notice if one of her children went missing? Or a father? They had 4 children at the beginning of the day and they only had 3 at the end. Think they might notice? I can see why Jip would ponder this. Even supposing you were a heartless gypsy who stole other people's children like pies off a cooling sill, wouldn't you care about one of your own? So I don't know if you remember when we talked about gypsies, but you don't hear very much about them anymore, at least not around here. But 50 years ago or so, and for much, much longer, obviously this is more like almost 170 years ago, there were groups of people who were gypsies, and they would have been descendants from gypsies in Romania, who had spread around the world. And they didn't have permanent homes. They would travel from place to place, and they would camp, set up camp with tents in their wagons, and they would sell things, and they would tell people's fortunes, and they kind of had a reputation as they might steal things. I don't know if there was any truth to that, but that was sort of the reputation that they had. Okay? So even supposing you were a heartless gypsy who stole other people's children like pies off a cooling sill, wouldn't you care about one of your own? Jip's hair was darkish and on the curly side. His ears stuck out a bit. Did Romany ears protrude? So remember, gypsies originally came from Romania. Did Romany ears protrude? That means stick out. The better to hear with, that was what he told Sheldon. But privately, staring into the wavy kitchen mirror, he thought they gave him the look of a two-handled jug. In the summer, his skin burned dark, and in the winter it was a perpetual shade of gray. But maybe that was because it didn't often get scrubbed. He was like a barn cat. He didn't mind giving himself a lick or two, but the sight of a tub of steaming water in the kitchen made him race toward the door. When he was tiny, Mrs. Lyman occasionally stripped him and doused him, but now he was too big to haul about. She gave up on baths. He might indeed be dark like a gypsy babe. On the other hand, perhaps, just perhaps, he was a child the Romanys had snatched from loving parents, who were still mourning the loss of their beautiful baby boy. Deacon Avery of the Congregational Church had come along the West Hill Road in his gig that day. He had gotten down and approached the child and told him to go home, like he was some stray, but it hadn't worked. So after lengthy hesitation and debate with his wife, the deacon had picked the odd little screaming bundle off the dirt of the road. His wife had made him take it direct to Reverend Goodrich. The worthy Reverend had 13 children of his own and a very low salary. With some reluctance, he in turn had called upon the authorities, that is to say, Mr. Flint, the overseer of the poor. It was the overseer's job to clear the town of tramps and transients and sweep the poor and mentally defective out of the village and onto the poor farm, where they would not offend the eyes and nostrils of God-fearing citizens, nor strain their purse strings overmuch. So in that time, it was to take anybody who was poor or mentally ill and take them and put them away from where other people could see them, and the town farm was where they would put them. Mr. Lyman had protested that the poor farm was not an orphan asylum, until Mr. Flint proposed that money could be extracted from the poor farm tax allocation to send the foundling to some distant institution. So Mr. Lyman, who's the poor farm manager, says, we don't take in kids, we don't raise up kids who don't have parents. But Mr. Flint, the overseer, says, well, if you don't take him in, I'm going to take money from you, the town poor farm, to send him to some kind of institution where he would be raised. And the foundling, that just means a child that's been found. Okay? Or alternatively, the child could be set up with a worthy Christian household closer by, again with fees from the poor farm budget. Mr. Lyman chose to keep his meager funds intact, so Mr. Lyman decided he needed all that money, so he would keep Jip. The farm manager prided himself that he had done well by the boy. He tried him in school once, but the other children complained of the smell, and even the little ones could make out the letters Jip could not. With so many citizens fleeing westward, tax revenues plummeted, and with them funds to operate the poor farm. In desperation, the manager hired Jip out to a local farmer. So actually, let me stop for a second. So this was a time period in Vermont in the middle 1800s, so around the 1840s, 1850s, where many people, the railroad had just come in, and many people were leaving Vermont to head west, where it was much easier to farm. There weren't the hills, there weren't all the rocks, and so they left Vermont. And when people leave Vermont, it means they're no longer paying taxes in Vermont, and that means that the state and the towns have less money. And so with so many people going west, the tax money that came in to the town decreased, and so there were fewer funds to send to the poor farm to help them eat and have clothing and everything that they needed to survive. So Mr. Lyman kept Jip, but in desperation, the manager hired Jip out to a local farmer. So instead of keeping him at the poor farm, he said, you're going to go work, you're going to live and work here, and the money that you earn will come back to the town poor farm. To Mrs. Lyman's suggestion that Jip might be a bit too young for a hired man, he'd said the plain truth. The boy is eating up all the profits, Mrs. Lyman. She couldn't argue. Even the boy listening to the debate knew the manager was right. For all his scrawniness, his skinniness, he shoveled in everything that wasn't nailed to the table. What does that mean, shoveled in? He ate, right? He ate everything that wasn't nailed to the table. But who will have him, she'd asked. Farmer Slater would. He would have anything he could beat and bully. His own dog cowered at the sight of him, so his own dog is afraid of him. Jip's most vivid memory of that time was being grabbed by an ear and dragged to see how badly he had swept the kitchen or shoveled out the barn. See, the man would yell. A blind idiot could do better. So that's meaning a blind idiot. So it was not a nice thing to say. As Jip swept and cried, the dog would find him and rub his body against the boy's legs and whimper its sympathy. Jip might be there yet, one ear larger than the other from all that yanking, but Farmer Slater upped and married a husky widow woman from Chelsea and sent his less than satisfactory hand back to the poor farm. To Jip, it felt like coming home, for the poor farm was the only home he could remember. He loved the rocky pastures. He loved standing in the spring wind, gazing at the distant hills, the green deeply pockmarked with the gray of Deacon Avery's granite quarry and the piles of slag around it. Slag is granite that can't be used, so big piles of rock. He loved the way the sun glinted off the stone. Perhaps when he was a man he would go to work there, driving shivs into the rock face with a great sledgehammer, filling the holes with black powder, and boom, blasting the huge granite blocks from the bedrock. When he came back to the poor farm after those few months away, he seemed a different boy. Privately, Mr. Lyman wondered why Slater had let him go. He wouldn't, of course, have said anything to anyone, for it was the poor who were to be grateful, not their managers. Lyman fancied himself not a fully healthy man, and the beasts and residents of the farm were a constant trial to him. They were a bother to him, a burden. The boy had a way with both, though. He was scarcely more than half the height of summer corn, but the flock of scrawny merino sheep would see him coming across the pasture and lope awkwardly over the hill to meet him. His front teeth were hardly out and in again, yet he was milking old Bonnie twice a day, and somehow the milk she had been so stingy with, however Mrs. Lyman tugged and yanked, flowed like a fountain under his small hands. And that year, instead of her usual stillbirth, which means a dead baby, old Bonnie bore a calf alive and healthy enough for Lyman to sell at a nice profit, a bit of which bought him some tobacco and a bottle of medicinal spirits to augment his store of homemade cider fermenting in the cellar. So Jip is really good with animals. And because he's really good with animals, he helps Mr. Lyman get more money for the farm because of his good way. The cow had a calf that Mr. Lyman could sell. How much of the manager's secret thoughts Jip knew or sensed it would be hard to say, but he was not dissatisfied with his life. Still, he was a normal boy and curious about a number of things. At the moment, he wished it was his ear against the door and not Mrs. Lyman's. He'd like to know what the overseer was saying about the mysterious lunatic. Jip! He came out of his daydream with a start. Mrs. Lyman jerked her head to summon him close. He left the cluster of residents at the stove and came around the big table to where she stood. Mr. Lyman will be wanting you, she said. But first, go out to the pump and put a rag to your face. Mercy, boy, the old overseer has come calling. We run a clean establishment around here. How will he know that if you go talking to him with a face like a pig snout? So she's telling him his face is dirty and he needs to go get it washed. Jip retraced his steps around the table. He was at the east door and ready to go out when she stopped him. Take Sheldon and wash his face too, you hear? Jip returned to the stove side, taking Sheldon's big hand in his own. And get his ears this time, she called out after the two of them. Why does Mr. Flint want to see me, Jip? Have I been bad? Bend over, Sheldon. I got to reach your ears. Have I, Jip? Nah. I don't know but what he's got a job of work for you and me. You and me, right, Jip? You and me together? Jip nodded. All right, you can straighten up now, Sheldon. You scrub up pretty as a heifer in a county fair. Sheldon looked troubled. Is that a joke, Jip? Yeah. The young man laughed, showing his gaggle of decayed and missing teeth. Jip smiled, rinsing out the rag and then working a little harder than usual on his own face. He took Sheldon's hand and they presented themselves for Mrs. Lyman's inspection. Mrs. Lyman opened the main kitchen door. As they came into the yard, the two men turned. A cage, Mr. Lyman said. A cage, Jip. We need a cage. Jip didn't ask what for, although he wanted to. The overseer's presence made him shy. How big? He asked. The manager turned to Mr. Flint. The tall man said, about as tall as I am, say 6 feet cube. Should do it without waste. Do you know what a cube is, boy? Yes, sir. But strong. I need it to be very strong. He looked doubtfully at Jip, up and down as if measuring his height. Perhaps we should hire it done, Mr. Lyman. Mr. Lyman was alarmed. And pay to have it done? Above the cost of materials, which will be considerable. Yes, well, the overseer said, but it must be strong. You'll need to buy iron hinges and a padlock. I ain't hardly the budget for such expensive. If we sent him to Brattleboro, it would take your entire appropriation, Mr. Lyman. Believe me, next town meeting, you'd be out of a job altogether. Mr. Lyman looked beaten. The boy and I can do it, he said. Sheldon can help, can't I, Jip? Can I? Sure, Sheldon, Jip said gently. No one here could get along without you. The overseer untied his horse and, washing his feet in their fancy boots to avoid the mud wherever possible, he walked his mare and wagon back to the main road. The next afternoon, as soon as Mr. Lyman could fetch the rock maple slats from the lumber yard and the hardware from Peck's store in the village, Jip and Sheldon set about building a cage for the lunatic. Okay, do you have a sense of the story so far? So they're on the town poor farm. Jip is one of the residents. Sheldon is a grown-up man, but he's what they call simple-minded. His brain doesn't work as well. So Jip kind of treats him like a child. He, encourages him and tells him how important he is to the job, whatever job they're doing. And so Jip is really good with the people at the town poor farm as well as the animals. Okay, and so Jip and Sheldon have been given the job of building a cage for the person who they are going to bring to the town poor farm that they are calling a lunatic. So someone who is not mentally healthy. Okay? All right. Tomorrow we'll see what happens because tomorrow's chapter is called The Lunatic. All right? All right. Remember to write down any words that you did not know their meaning as I read. I hope I stopped and I hope you got the overall meaning, but write down any words you didn't understand and send them to me. You can send them to me and just create a document or a video in your portfolio on Class Dojo and send it to me, and I will make sure we stop and explain those before we go on tomorrow. Okay? All right. See you then.